Welcome back to this special compilation on Vietnamese case files. Today, we revisit shocking case files where greed, betrayal, and reckless decisions led to irreversible tragedies. From the mysterious legal battle over a 55 million USD lottery jackpot in Saigon to an unprecedented fraud scandal on the international esports stage, we will witness the downfall of those in positions of power, from a dedicated social worker who exploited her own community for personal gain, to a former senator who spiraled into prison over gun theft and fraud, as well as the secret behind over a 80 million USD money laundering station hidden in the dreamy city of Dalat. Each case represents a fragment of the fragile boundary between justice and crime. Join Vietnamese case files as we delve into the details right now. And if you enjoy investigative true crime content and want to follow along with Vietnamese case files and upcoming cases, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss a single episode. Now, let's begin. On the morning of October 25th, 2009, a Vietnamese-American businessman named Lee Sam visited the Palazzo Club, located inside the Sheraton Saigon Hotel, for entertainment as usual. He chose slot machine number 13 and played the game Landlord with an initial stake of $300. For more than 1 hour, the machine operated normally, consuming nearly all of his money without showing any unusual signs. Suddenly, at around 11 o'clock in the morning, the machine's screen began flashing and announced that he had won exactly $55,542,256.7. The staggering amount falling from the sky left Lee Sam in shock. Remaining cautious, he tried playing one more round with a $5 bet. This time, the machine registered a loss and deducted $5, leaving the displayed winning balance unchanged at $55,542,251.7 in the player's credit account. Only then did Lee Sam stop playing, believing that he had become a millionaire thanks to extraordinary luck. News of the jackpot spread rapidly throughout the club, and many curious patrons gathered around machine number 13 to witness the historic figure firsthand. Lee Sam immediately used his mobile phone to photograph the machine's screen as evidence, while also requesting club staff to verify the result and proceed with the payout. A female staff member present promptly called the club's technician for assistance. The technician reset the machine to its initial menu state and conducted a comprehensive inspection. Notably, when Lee Sam asked whether there was any malfunction with the machine, the technician replied in English, roughly translated as, "There's no problem." I don't know. This on-site assurance of no problem from the technical staff led Lee Sam to believe that the winning result was entirely legitimate and not a display error. However, at that point, the displayed amount was so enormous that it exceeded the authority of the on-duty staff to handle. The Palazzo Club's manager at the time, Mr. Moran, was on leave abroad. After receiving a phone call reporting the incident, Mr. Moran instructed by phone that because the amount was extremely large, the staff were not allowed to resolve it on their own and should wait for him to return to handle it in person. The manager also promised that the payout would be made within 3 days to the jackpot winner. However, he refused to provide any on-the-spot written confirmation to the guest. Seeing this, Lee Sam took the initiative to draft a written record confirming the winning result, with signatures from many surrounding players as witnesses to the figure of more than 55 million USD displayed on the screen. No representative from the club signed this document, but the extraordinary event was still supported by both photographic evidence and witness signatures. This step showed that Lee Sam had anticipated every possible risk. After leaving the casino, he waited for the promised payout, yet more than 3 days passed without receiving the money. 20 days after the win, the club manager himself, Mr. Moran, came to Lee Sam's private residence to negotiate a settlement. According to Sam, the manager offered to pay 20 million USD, but on the condition that Sam would share a commission of up to 40% with the club, meaning he would actually receive only 12 million USD. Lee Sam refused this arrangement. A few days later, an American man representing Palazzo's foreign investor met with Sam and offered only $10,000 to wrap it up. This offer, less than 0.02% of the winnings, was absurdly unreasonable, so Lee Sam rejected it outright. Unable to reach an agreement, on November 27, 2009, Lee Sam sent an official notice to the general director of Ocean Joint Venture Company, the entity operating Palazzo, demanding full payment of the winnings. In response, the company acknowledged that the winning amount had been displayed, but refused to pay, claiming that the machine suffered a technical malfunction. This reply left Lee Sam stunned, as he believed he had been deceived. Determined to protect his rights, in February 2010, Lee Sam filed a lawsuit against Ocean Joint Venture Company at the People's Court of District 1, Ho Chi Minh City. The civil case seeking slot machine winnings worth up to 55.5 million USD officially began, opening an unprecedented legal battle that would be arduous and last for many years. Given the case's complexity and its high-tech elements, before officially stepping into court, both the plaintiff and the defendant engaged in a meticulous race to prepare evidence. The plaintiff who filed the lawsuit was Lee Sam, a Vietnamese-American businessman originally from Ca Mau. Before 1975, he left Vietnam, resettled in the United States, and later returned to Vietnam to invest and do business. By the time of the incident, Lee Sam was 55 years old, owned a large restaurant in Ho Chi Minh City, and lived a comfortable life. He was also an experienced gambler. Lee Sam had been a member of the Palazzo Club since 2005, visited frequently for entertainment, and had won twice before this incident for a total of $95,000. On both occasions, the club paid him in full. Moreover, among Palazzo's patrons, he was considered a VIP member. On the other side, the defendant was Ocean Joint Venture Company. This joint venture owned and operated the well-known five-star Sheraton Saigon Hotel and Towers, located at 88 Dong Krai Street, District 1, Ho Chi Minh City. Inside the hotel, the Palazzo Club was a prize gaming venue reserved for foreigners. Ocean was established in the late 1990s amid Vietnam's opening to attract investment into high-end hospitality. 70% of the company's shares belong to the Kek Seng Real Estate Group of Hong Kong through its Singapore subsidiary, while 30% belong to a Vietnamese partner. The joint venture's charter capital was 29.1 million USD. In other words, Ocean Joint Venture Company was the owner behind the Sheraton Saigon and the Palazzo Club, a major player in Vietnam's hospitality and entertainment sector. Prior to the lawsuit, Ocean Joint Venture had been highly profitable, largely due to its slot machine business serving foreign customers. In 2009, Palazzo's prize gaming revenue alone was around 68 million USD. In the years that followed, Kek Seng's consolidated financial reports showed that Ocean Joint Venture generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue each year. For example, in 2011, revenue reached 629 million Hong Kong dollars, with net profit of over 13 million USD. Because this was a civil lawsuit, the police played only a secondary role, mainly assisting the parties with investigation and evidence collection. The main battlefield was the contest between the two sides' legal representatives to maximize their chances of winning in court. In addition, court representatives also became involved to examine the collected evidence and verify certain information provided by both sides. Therefore, the investigative process itself was not recorded in detail, and the public only learned about the legal developments when the plaintiff and the defendant presented their facts in court in late 2012. As soon as the lawsuit was accepted, two opposing hypotheses emerged. Either the machine truly had a technical malfunction, or the club deliberately tried to avoid paying out the enormous jackpot. At the same time, a secondary hypothesis also appeared that the player might have attempted to cheat. However, that line of suspicion was quickly dismissed because there were no signs of any high-tech tampering with the machine after the technician's inspection. And CCTV footage covering slot machine number 13 showed no moment in which Lee Sam carried out any unusual interference with the machine. Next, the specifications and data of the gaming machine were examined in detail. Machine number 13 was an electronic gaming machine imported from Malaysia in September 2009, and it had been inspected by the Ministry of Finance before being put into operation. The machine's operating principle was fairly simple. The player places a bet, the machine generates random results, and if the player wins, the amount is added to the player's on-machine account. If the player loses, it is deducted. The balance shown in the account column is the basis for the club to pay out when a play session ends. Before October 25th, 2009, the machine had been operated many times and had paid out small amounts without any incident. And judging by the transaction log on October 25th, 2009, along with the photo of machine number 13 displaying the figure of 55.5 million USD, Lee Sam's jackpot win appeared completely transparent. At this stage, investigators focused on whether machine number 13 was defective. The court decided to request a technical examination of the machine. However, an unexpected development emerged. Machine number 13 was not sealed immediately after the incident. Normally, in a dispute like this, the contested machine or equipment would be preserved in its original condition for inspection. However, Ocean Joint Venture Company quietly removed the main circuit board from machine number 13 and sent it to the overseas manufacturer for testing, without Lee Sam's presence or any court appointment. This raised concerns that any inspection results presented by Ocean would not be accepted, because there was a possibility they could have swapped the circuit board during their own examination process. The investigative focus then shifted toward documentary evidence and testimony. According to the defendant, machine number 13 was programmed so that winnings could not exceed $50,000 per round. They argued that it was impossible for a bet of only $0.1 to produce a payout of 55 million USD, and that the display must have resulted from an overflow error or a rare software malfunction. However, when asked to prove this with specific data, the defendant produced only a manufacturer's inspection report stating that the machine had malfunctioned. This report lacked legal standing because it was not commissioned by the court, and the court also questioned how the circuit board had been preserved. As a result, the direct technical evidence was almost worthless after the defendant's hasty actions. Instead, the court was forced to rely on indirect evidence and technical logic. An on-site inspection record was drawn up on June 3, 2010 at the Palazzo Club, with participation from court representatives Lee Sam and the company. The record stated that the game's payout principle was based on the account column, meaning whatever amount the machine displayed in the player's account had to be paid in full. Both the plaintiff and the defendant agreed to this principle at the time of the inspection. This was a crucial detail that contradicted the defendant's later position that the machine malfunctioned, so payment cannot be made according to the account. In addition, the court required the company to provide the house rules and participation terms for Palazzo Club's games. The results showed that the rules contained no clause defining what constituted a technical malfunction or how such a situation should be handled. There was also no clause stating that in the event of any machine malfunction, results are void, as is commonly seen in international casinos. The court viewed this loophole as a disadvantage for the defendant. Because players were not warned in advance that a machine error could void winnings, Lee Sam had a legitimate basis to argue that the displayed result was the actual result, and that even if the machine had a problem, full payment was still required because the fault lay with the club. During witness testimony, many patrons present that day confirmed they personally saw the machine display 55.5 million USD, and they saw that Lee Sam engaged in no unusual behavior other than pressing the play button as normal. Notably, one witness recalled a conversation with the foreign technician immediately after the incident, reaffirming the phrase, "there's no problem," said by that technician. This testimony matched Lee Sam's account, further reinforcing the argument that the machine showed no obvious malfunction on the spot. As for club staff, because of the sensitivity of the case, most on-duty employees that day refused to appear as public witnesses. However, the club's extracted security footage supported Lee Sam. Therefore, Lee Sam's legal representatives, Min Dong Quang law firm led by attorney Trun Zoa, emphasized that their client had lawfully won the sum of 55 million USD and that machine number 13 was fully compliant and had passed inspection. They argued that since the machine had operated normally, accepted Lee Sam's money many times, and paid out smaller wins, there was no basis to deny the jackpot this time on the grounds of a technical malfunction. The attorneys also accused the defendant of quietly sending the machine for inspection in order to dispose of evidence, a serious violation of procedural rules. On Ocean's side, the defendant's representatives and legal team, including foreign advisors, focused on demonstrating the implausibility of a 55 million USD result. They claimed the maximum programmed payout was only $50,000, and that the figure of 55.5 million was clearly caused by a screen flicker or display error when the machine suffered an electronic malfunction. They also argued that Lee Sam was experienced and understood that gambling against a machine is a matter of luck, and therefore should have accepted technical risk. It is clear that the defendant's argument relied mainly on logical inference and international practice rather than scientific evidence, because the only scientific evidence had been destroyed by their own actions. Based on the facts presented by both sides at trial, the court reconstructed the overall picture as follows. Before October 25, 2009, Ocean Joint Venture Company operated the Palazzo Club with 6 newly imported gaming machines, including machine number 13. Each machine was programmed with specific games and payout levels in accordance with company regulations. Under the programming, the maximum jackpot per round was $50,000. In principle, if a player placed a small bet, the game system could hardly jump to a jackpot of tens of millions unless there was a serious software failure. Palazzo's management likely checked the machines and found them operating normally before opening to customers. They gave no warning to staff or patrons about any malfunction involving machine number 13. On the morning of October 25, 2009, when Lee Sam began playing on machine number 13, the company continued operating as usual, with no one expecting the machine to produce a bizarre result. At around 11 o'clock, machine 13 flashed and displayed a prize of 55.5 million USD. According to the manufacturer's hypothesis, due to an incorrect line of code or a hardware fault, the machine may have generated an out-of-control number. Manager Moran was shocked when he received the call and quickly instructed staff to suspend any payout and wait for his return. This can be seen as a delaying tactic, avoiding a direct confrontation inside a crowded casino while buying time for the company to calculate its next move. As soon as Moran returned to the country, the company held an emergency meeting with its foreign partner and the machine's manufacturer. Within a few weeks, they formed an initial view that the machine had malfunctioned and began implementing a strategy of behind-the-scenes negotiation. Moran was assigned to privately negotiate with Lee Sam, proposing 20 million USD on the condition that Sam remain silent and share a commission back to the club. When the 20 million USD offer failed, they shifted to a tougher tactic by sending an American representative from the foreign partner to push the offer down to just $10,000. However, this strategy backfired because Lee Sam was a seasoned and steadfast businessman. With their VIP patron threatening to sue, Ocean switched into legal defense mode. They took the most controversial step, removing the circuit board from machine number 13 for a confidential inspection. From their perspective, this was necessary to understand the cause of the error and secure technical grounds for court. However, doing so without any third-party witness violated procedural requirements. The manufacturer's inspection result, treated by the company as a trump card in the legal showdown, was dismissed without mercy due to procedural flaws. As a result, from 2010 to 2012, Ocean Joint Venture Company largely remained on the defensive in the first instance proceedings. They submitted multiple arguments that the machine malfunctioned, that the registered maximum payout was capped, and that because Sam had been paid normally in prior wins, he should bear the loss this time if it was an error. In addition, the company also appeared to prepare to use the Fourth Estate to pressure the outcome, warning media circles that forcing payment of 55 million USD would make casino investors wary of Vietnam. This suggested the company was highly skilled in public relations, trying to frame its own problem as an industry-wide issue in order to gain support. However, those maneuvers did not intimidate the court. The lawsuit's outcome brought satisfaction to both those directly involved and the public, at least until an unexpected turning point appeared and put an end to everything. On December 28, 2012, the People's Court of District 1, Ho Chi Minh City opened the first hearing. The plaintiff, Lee Sam, attended in person along with a legal team from Min Dung Quang law firm. The defendant, Ocean Joint Venture Company, sent senior representatives along with a team of lawyers and legal advisors. The trial was held publicly, but due to the case's special nature, the court limited the number of journalists allowed to attend in order to maintain order. The atmosphere in the courtroom was described as tense and fiery. Lawyers from both sides repeatedly clashed over the key issue, slot machine number 13. The plaintiff's side, in addition to the physical and digital evidence they had collected, also cited legal provisions. Under those provisions, prize-based electronic gaming is a conditional business activity, but the law does not allow a business to arbitrarily void results for internal reasons. Therefore, Ocean's refusal to pay was a breach of the agreement and required appropriate compensation. On the defendant's side, The lawyers focused their rebuttal on the claim that the 55.5 million USD result was invalid due to a technical malfunction. They presented professional reports and urged the court to consider international precedents where, when a machine malfunctions, the operator may be exempt from paying out. In addition, they cited that Lee Sam had been paid $95,000 for 2 prior wins, arguing this proved the company never cheats rightful winners. The procuracy representative participating in the trial immediately questioned the basis for the defendant's determination that the machine had malfunctioned. When asked why they had not invited an independent domestic appraisal body to verify the machine, the defendant faltered and claimed that local experts were not capable, so they had to send it back to the manufacturer. This prompted the trial panel to signal disagreement, because procedural steps must be decided by the court, and the defendant's unilateral actions were unlawful. The first instance trial continued over many consecutive days, lasting into early January 2013. Ultimately, on the afternoon of January 7th, 2013, the court issued its first instance judgment. The judgment accepted the full scope of Lee Sam's claims and ordered Ocean Joint Venture Company to immediately pay Lee Sam the jackpot amount of 55.5 million USD. In addition, the company was required to pay first instance court fees of more than $57,000, and Lee Sam was to be refunded $27,000 in advanced court fee payments. Lee Sam's separate claim for interest totaling more than 3.5 million USD was not considered because he had not paid the required advance fee for that portion. However, the court preserved his right to file a separate lawsuit for interest if he wished. His request to revoke Ocean's business license was rejected as beyond the court's authority. The trial panel also affirmed that the company was responsible for paying the exact amount displayed by the machine, regardless of the cause, in order to protect players' rights and ensure transparency in business operations. Judge Mai Xuan Bin also stated that this was the first time a Vietnamese court had handled a lawsuit seeking such a large gaming payout, and that the court had studied the evidence very carefully to reach a fair decision. Upon hearing the court rule in his favor, Lee Sam and his legal team erupted in celebration, and many people in the courtroom applauded in approval. Lee Sam smiled and told the press that he was very satisfied with the judgment and that he had confidence in Vietnam's legal system. In contrast, Ocean Joint Venture Company was stunned and disappointed. The defendant's lawyer told reporters that they respected but did not agree with the verdict and would certainly appeal. That very afternoon, the company's representative filed an appeal in full. As for the procuracy, it also issued separate recommendations on certain procedural matters, such as the case exceeding statutory time limits. But the court explained that the delay was due to the case's complexity, the need to collect extensive evidence, and the defendant's lack of cooperation. Public opinion at the time generally leaned in support of Lee Sam. Many viewed the ruling as a victory of the underdog against a large corporation and hoped he would receive the money soon. The appellate hearing was then scheduled for January 2nd, 2014 at the People's Court of Ho Chi Minh City, as both sides had appealed. However, an unusual situation occurred. Before the trial date, Lee Sam suddenly submitted a petition to withdraw the entire lawsuit and his appeal, stating that machine number 13 had a technical malfunction that led him to mistakenly believe he had won. At the same time, the defendant, Ocean Joint Venture Company, also withdrew its appeal and requested that the case be dismissed. As a result, the appellate session on the afternoon of January 2nd, 2014 lasted less than 15 minutes, with neither party present. The trial panel announced that both sides had withdrawn their petitions and declared the appellate proceedings terminated, the case dismissed, and the first instance judgment dated January 7th, 2013 annulled. Thus, legally speaking, the case ended with no one winning or losing. The sudden turn led many to believe that a private agreement had been reached between the two sides. And indeed, a lawyer who followed the case told the press that the parties had reached an out-of-court settlement, but that the details could not be disclosed. Even so, it was widely inferred that Lee Sam had obtained some benefit sufficient for him to abandon the long legal battle and the sum of more than 55 million USD. In any case, this sudden U-turn left the public disappointed and raised questions about transparency, especially when a lone individual had to face a powerful company backed by foreign partners. One day in early 2019, a middle-aged Vietnamese man walked into a local IRS office, his face filled with confusion. He said he had just received a notice that his tax return for that year had been filed twice, even though he had not submitted any return at all. This unusual case was quickly escalated to federal investigators specializing in tax fraud. From their initial assessment, they realized this was likely only the tip of the iceberg, because similar cases soon began appearing one after another. Tracing paper records, electronic data, and leads linked to return preparation, investigators noticed that the suspicious filings gradually pointed back to the same place. A travel agency that also prepared tax returns in Westminster called Century Travel and Tax. Around the same time, another investigative track suggested that personal data had likely been leaked from public benefits files, as if someone on the inside had quietly provided information so another party could turn it into fake documents and fraudulent tax returns. Evidence included multiple benefit files opened under different names, but sharing the same contact address, as well as signs that information had been altered. As the early leads converged on a single business, Century Travel and Tax was quickly identified as the most critical choke point. From that moment, the investigation was formally expanded. The multi-agency task force then executed search warrants at several locations, including the Century Travel and Tax office in Westminster. There, agents found a large volume of suspicious financial paperwork, with stacks of tax forms and refund claims piled up. Most notably, they discovered numerous 1099 MISC forms filled out in a highly unusual way. Shortly afterward, computers, accounting books, and storage devices such as USB drives at the scene were seized for investigative purposes. The first critical leads began to come into focus. To begin with, there were signs that an employee within a public agency had provided many people's personal information to outsiders. This was reflected in the fact that most of the victims were individuals receiving social benefits and were connected to the same benefits counselor. Next, the fraudulent tax returns were consistently prepared through certain private tax preparation businesses. When investigators cross-checked the tax preparer identification numbers on the returns, they noticed two names appearing with striking frequency: Century Travel and Tax and Victory Tax Service, both located in Westminster. Finally, these fraudulent filings shared one clear common pattern. They used Form 1099 MISC to report income that did not actually exist for the victims, people whose identities had been stolen, while also claiming those same amounts as business expenses for other clients. This method generated two illegal benefits at once. On one hand, it forced the government to pay out larger tax refunds. On the other, it helped certain businesses reduce the taxes they owed by inflating deductible expenses. The first real breakthrough came when a female victim, after understanding what had happened, provided a crucial detail. She said that while applying for social benefits at the county office, a social services worker had asked her for additional personal information about herself and her children, and even kept copies of her identification documents. Because the worker seemed very enthusiastic and helpful, she had not suspected anything at the time. When investigators checked the personnel list, they discovered that this helpful employee was John Trun, a longtime staff member of the Orange County Social Services Agency. From there, the direction of the investigation was quickly set. Digging deeper, investigators learned that John had abruptly resigned in October 2018 after 24 years at the agency. A review of internal records showed that management had suspected he was abusing his data access shortly before leaving, but before an internal inquiry could begin, John submitted his resignation. Meanwhile, on the tax filing side of the investigation, another key witness emerged. A business client of Century Travel and Tax quietly contacted prosecutors to offer cooperation. This person was later identified as Kevin Lay, 57 years old, who admitted he had paid for tax reduction services through intermediaries. Kevin said that a few years earlier, rumors began circulating within the local business community about a creative tax strategy, hiring outsiders as fake employees to increase payroll expenses and thereby reduce a business's taxable income. Through a referral, Kevin sought out Anton Nguyen, a well-known tax preparer in Westminster. There, Anton suggested creating fraudulent Form 1099 MISC documents. Under their arrangement, Kevin only needed to pay Anton 10% of the taxes saved, and in exchange, his business would significantly reduce its tax liability. Driven by greed, Kevin agreed to participate without ever investigating whose identities were being used for those fake employees. This statement perfectly matched the evidence investigators had already collected. Records showed that Anton Nguyen received 2 checks totaling 26,000 USD from Kevin Lay on May 2nd, 2017, equal to about 10% of the value of the fraudulent one. 099 forms Anton created for that business. With these key leads, the full picture of the case began to come into view. John Trun stole the personal information of people receiving social benefits, mostly immigrants with limited legal knowledge who feared losing their benefits and therefore did not dare to speak up. He supplied these identities to Anton Nguyen, the owner of Century Travel and Tax, and to Rosemary Pham, the owner of Victory Tax Service. This group played the central role in the scheme, creating a large number of fake tax filings to profit from 2 directions at once. On one hand, the stolen identities were used to file returns and claim refunds through credits, such as the Earned Income Tax Credit or the Child Tax Credit. On the other hand, the associated businesses inflated labor expenses to reduce the amount of tax they owed. At this point, the investigation entered its most intense phase, focused on consolidating evidence to end a fraud that had lasted nearly 9 years. The objective was clear: to collect and analyze all necessary proof in order to bring the suspects before the court. On the data analysis front, the IRS digital forensics team began extracting information from the seized computers and devices. They recovered emails, messages, and relevant note logs one by one. On Anton Nguyen's laptop, investigators found a list of social security numbers paired with names, matching many of the victims previously identified. In parallel, financial specialists reviewed all related banking transactions. The results showed that John Trun and several accomplices had opened more than 12 bank accounts under other people's names, specifically the names of identity theft victims. These accounts were used to receive federal tax refunds from fraudulent filings. As soon as the money arrived, the group quickly withdrew cash, broke transactions into smaller amounts, or purchased cashier's checks to erase their trail. This method of laundering and dispersing funds helped them avoid the banking system's suspicious transaction reporting mechanisms. When investigators pieced together hundreds of small transactions, the overall financial picture gradually became clear. Nearly 1 million USD in federal tax refunds had been siphoned off, while participating businesses benefited by reducing roughly 3.7 million USD in taxes owed through inflated expense claims. Overall, the government lost at least 3.77 million USD in tax revenue, while also mistakenly paying out nearly 973 USD in refunds. All of these figures were carefully cross-checked against seized documents and witness statements to ensure legal accuracy. During the search of John Trun's residence, investigators uncovered additional key evidence. In his garage, they found a box of old files containing copies of many people's documents, including benefits applications, photocopies of identification papers, and social security cards. In addition, John's personal notebook suggested a gambling habit, with multiple pages recording sports betting scores and wager amounts. This was likely the vice that led him down the path of crime in search of money. In addition, another special investigative technique played an important supporting role: big data analysis. The investigative team used computer systems to scan tax filings nationwide in order to identify fraud patterns with shared characteristics. Through this method, they initially identified 433 suspicious filings, all tied to a cluster of tax preparation businesses in Orange County. Relationship link charts showed that the network center revolved around John Trun, Anton Nguyen, Rosemary Pham, and their associated clients. The combination of modern technology and traditional investigative methods enabled authorities to pinpoint the key suspects across the entire operation. As for witnesses who were identified as accomplices, their initial statements were evasive and denied responsibility. During questioning, Anton Nguyen denied knowing John Trun, admitting only that he had heard the name because they were part of the same community. Rosemary Pham likewise insisted her business activities were entirely legal and claimed she had done nothing wrong. However, when confronted with evidence from emails and check transactions, Anton began cooperating to a certain extent in hopes of receiving leniency. Given the scale of the case and the number of individuals involved, authorities decided to carry out a coordinated action plan. In the early morning of a day in late 2019, federal agents quietly approached and arrested John Trun at his home in Fountain Valley. Nearly at the same time, another investigative team went to Anton Nguyen's home. However, Instead of being handcuffed on the spot, Anton was served with a subpoena. Because the allegations were primarily financial in nature, the flight risk was considered low, and he had legal representation. Rosemary Pham faced a similar situation when she was served with a subpoena at her home in Midway City. As for other accomplices who were business owners such as Kevin Lay, Thomas Nguyen, Peter Nguyen, Van Quoc, Cho Nguyen, and Sophie Nguyen, most had either cooperated with investigators or had already been charged earlier. The identities of the masterminds, in this case, truly shocked the local Vietnamese community because they were people who had long been seen as trustworthy. John Trun, in his early 60s, was a Vietnamese American and had worked as a social services employee in Orange County. He had settled in the United States from a young age, lived a stable life, and remained in public service for 24 years, from 1994 to 2018. Yet behind that seemingly ordinary exterior, John carried a gambling habit that had lasted for years. This addiction to gambling was believed to be the reason he spiraled, as his financial demands increasingly exceeded what he could afford. John's advantage in committing the crime lay in his deep understanding of the social welfare system. He knew how benefits files were created and managed, and he could exploit that knowledge to profit for himself and for people close to him. At the same time, with years of accumulated knowledge and experience, John was capable of coordinating with outside financial service providers, becoming the connecting link between the public benefits machinery and organized financial fraud. The investigation found that John Trun had no prior criminal record, but a moral collapse led him to exploit the very vulnerable people he was supposed to protect. Notably, some victims were directly preyed upon by John himself. For example, in 2007, he persuaded a man who had just arrived in the United States to lend him a credit card, then secretly spent on it and ran up a debt of 14,000 USD. That poor immigrant also believed he had to keep a government official happy for his family to continue receiving benefits. Only when the case was exposed did he realize he had been deceived and was left carrying a debt that seemed to come from nowhere. As for Anton Nguyen, 54 years old, he was a Vietnamese American and the owner of Century Travel and Tax. With deep knowledge of tax law, Anton understood exactly which loopholes could be exploited, including the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit credits, designed to support low-income people with young children. He was involved in setting up shell companies, and there were even signs that Anton himself was behind the creation of these entities in order to issue fraudulent documentation. Within the entire operation, Anton played a central role, coordinating financial strategies and acting as the architect of a systematic profit scheme. For each job, Anton took roughly 10% of the fraudulent amount. Over the period from 2012 to 2019, he pocketed about 3.7 million USD. Anton used this money to expand his business operations and enrich himself. There were no signs that he was entangled in vices like John Trun. His actions appeared to stem purely from greed and calculation. Rosemary Pham, 65 years old, was a well-known tax preparer in Westminster and the owner of Victory Tax Service. She joined the ring in a role similar to Anton Nguyen, though on a smaller scale. Rosemary was accused of helping prepare fraudulent filings, including overstating fuel tax credits for certain clients. The business owner accomplices were also identified one by one. Kevin Lay, 57 years old, the owner of a business in Anaheim Hills, used the scheme to evade about 2.93 million USD in taxes. Thomas Nguyen, 62 years old, a businessman in Santa Ana, benefited at a lower level about 133,000 USD. Van Quoc, 43 years old, residing in Monterey Park, evaded more than 231,000 USD in taxes and received a suspended sentence along with a fine. Peter Duc Nguyen, 63 years old, living in Garden Grove, evaded about 187,000 USD. Finally, Xiao Nguyen, 69 years old, and Sophie Thuy Nguyen, 48 years old, both residing in Orange County, were also accused of tax evasion and were awaiting the court's final ruling. Most of these individuals were small business owners within the community, connected through acquaintanceship and, in some cases, family ties. They understood their actions were wrong, but still participated for economic gain. This tax and benefits fraud operated quietly for nearly a decade, beginning in the late 2000s. The person who set this chain of wrongdoing in motion was John Trun. At first, he abused his access to personal files for small-scale gains, such as opening credit cards in other people's names. When those acts went undetected, John gradually developed a larger plan. Using the identities of low-income individuals, people who had little or no need to file taxes, to create fraudulent tax returns and extract refunds from the government. Realizing he did not have the expertise to carry out complex tax manipulations, John Trun began looking for accomplices within the community, and by 2012 he had connected with Anton Nguyen, a well-known tax specialist in Westminster. Later, Rosemary Pham, the owner of another tax preparation business, also joined the operation in a similar role, expanding the network and increasing the number of fraudulent filings. From 2013 to 2015, this fraud machine ran relatively smoothly. Each tax season, John Trun selectively targeted poor immigrants, especially families with young children, so they would qualify for certain tax credits. Then Anton and Rosemary used these identities to create fraudulent 1099 filings tied to businesses, allowing those businesses to inflate expenses and reduce the taxes they owed. At the same time, the group also filed tax returns under the victims' names to claim refunds, then routed the money into accounts controlled by the ring. Because the amount tied to each return was not very large and was spread out over many years, the scheme avoided the IRS's attention for a long time. Starting in 2016, the scale of the fraud began to expand, and the boldness increased noticeably. John Trun did not stop at supplying identities. He also directly created fake benefits files for relatives to siphon county welfare funds. Rosemary Pham even went further by inflating less common credits, such as fuel tax credits. Around the same period, the number of businesses participating in tax evasion continued to grow, making some filings increasingly unusual in size. The turning point came in 2019, when the first victims discovered their identities had been used to submit fraudulent tax returns. At the same time, internal file handovers at the Orange County Social Services Agency exposed additional irregularities tied to cases handled by John Trun. When leads from the tax system and the public benefits system were connected, authorities formally launched a comprehensive investigation and successfully dismantled the fraud ring. The case was brought to federal court in Santa Ana, California. In reality, most defendants chose to plead guilty in exchange for potential leniency rather than proceed to a lengthy jury trial. As a result, the courtroom developments largely focused on conviction and sentencing based on plea agreements, along with the aggravating and mitigating factors for each defendant. John Trun was the first to plead guilty in November 2019 to charges including conspiracy to defraud the government, mail fraud, and aggravated identity theft. If the maximum penalties for each count were added together, he could have faced up to 72 years in prison. However, because he pleaded guilty and cooperated to some extent, his actual sentence was 4 years and 9 months in prison, along with an obligation to pay $1 million in restitution. In court, the defense submitted John Trun's letter of remorse. In it, he expressed shame, accepted responsibility for his actions, and apologized to the victims. John also promised that after serving his sentence, he would rebuild his life and help the community with addiction prevention efforts. Anton Nguyen initially denied the allegations, but later reached a plea agreement on April 10, 2023. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the government, and in exchange, other charges, such as making false statements, were dismissed under the agreement. On August 21st, 2023, the court sentenced Anton Nguyen to 3 years and 5 months in prison, along with $3.7 million in restitution, equal to the total tax loss caused by the scheme. As accomplices pleaded guilty one after another and received sentences, Rosemary Pham also changed her position. She admitted to conspiracy to defraud and to assisting in the preparation of fraudulent tax filings. At her court hearing in October 2023, prosecutors requested a 37-month sentence because Rosemary's role was considered less severe than Anton Nguyen's. However, after considering her advanced age and personal circumstances, the judge sentenced Rosemary to 12 months in prison. In addition, she was ordered to pay nearly $900,000 in restitution, matching the portion of tax losses she was accused of helping cause. For the group of business owner accomplices, hearings were held intermittently from 2021 to 2023. Kevin Lay later pleaded guilty to tax evasion and was sentenced to 6 months in prison, along with a fine of 15,000 USD and an obligation to pay million USD in restitution. Thomas Nguyen also pleaded guilty to tax evasion, but received only a 30,000 USD fine and 133,000 USD in restitution without any prison time, most likely due to his limited role or his health condition. Vun Quach was sentenced to 2 years of probation, fined 5.5 thousand USD, and ordered to pay 231 USD in restitution. Peter Duc Nguyen, a similar sentence, 2 years of probation and 187,000 USD in restitution. Châu Nguyen and Sophie Thuy Nguyen both pleaded guilty and are awaiting sentencing with a maximum possible penalty of up to 5 years in prison, though it is likely they will also receive probation because they pleaded guilty early. Although the case has closed on the legal front, its social aftershocks have continued, especially within the Vietnamese community in Orange County. When local media reported the sentences for John Trun and Anton Nguyen, many people could not hide their shock and outrage. In their eyes, John was someone who should have protected the poor and vulnerable, yet he exploited the very people who placed their trust in him. On community forums, many voices condemned him for damaging the community's collective reputation, and some even called him a rotten apple who spoiled the bunch. This case also sounded an alarm about serious gaps in oversight and management. Soon after, Orange County officials acknowledged their responsibility and quickly implemented necessary corrective measures. The Orange County Social Services Agency also strengthened internal audits and invested in improving its technology infrastructure. Regular audit cycles were applied to the benefits data system, alongside the creation of a dedicated quality assurance unit to review files and detect unusual signs early. In addition, county leadership worked with the district attorney's office to establish a hotline, encouraging employees to proactively report suspicious conduct by coworkers. Modern monitoring technologies were also put into use to track and flag instances where employees access data beyond the scope of their duties, reducing the risk of similar misconduct happening again. From a media standpoint, the case did not cause a nationwide sensation, but it was still covered by major outlets such as the Los Angeles Times and the Orange County Register, drawing significant attention from the local public. From the information that was made public, people gained practical lessons for themselves. For residents, staying alert and protecting personal information is especially important. Whether dealing with government staff or private service providers, we should not hand over full identification documents unless truly necessary, and we should closely monitor tax and credit notices so we can detect unusual signs in time. What do you think? Has John Trun truly felt remorse for what he did, and can he change as he promised in court? Share your thoughts in the comments and suggest the next case you'd like us to cover. At 12 p.m. on December 15th, the upper bracket final of Arena of Valor between the Thailand women's team and the Vietnam women's team officially began as part of SEA Games 33. This was the focal match of the entire tournament, as both Thailand and Vietnam were considered top contenders for the gold medal. Fans were expecting an intense, high-level showdown, fast-paced, dramatic, and decided only in the final moments. However, the actual outcome left audiences deeply disappointed. In the first game, the Vietnamese team secured victory after just 10 minutes of play. The second game was the most competitive, lasting over 17 minutes, yet the points still went to Vietnam. By the third game, the Vietnamese team finished off their opponents to seal a decisive 3-0 victory. In short, there was hardly any drama at all. Vietnam completely destroyed their opponents and advanced straight to the grand final with little resistance. But if there was no drama on the esports stage, there was plenty behind the scenes. A few hours after the match concluded, shocking news broke that a Thai player had cheated during the competition. The athlete was reportedly caught red-handed, but at the time, referees allowed the match to continue to avoid disrupting other teams. Only after everything was over was the information publicly disclosed. So who was it, and how did she manage to cheat in a tournament of this scale? Public opinion was stunned when it was revealed to be Warasin Naraphat, nicknamed Tokyogurl, the marksman player for the Thailand women's team. According to the organizers, during the match, they noticed several suspicious behaviors from the athlete. She repeatedly covered her phone screen whenever a supervisor approached, used a fan and her hands to avoid direct camera surveillance of her device, and performed unnatural actions on her phone screen, even while the match itself was at an extremely intense stage. Immediately afterward, the supervisor discreetly paused the match to inspect the phone Warasin's competition device. Right away, he spotted something that should never appear on any official tournament device. The Discord app icon was still running in the background, along with a small on-screen indicator showing that a screen sharing session was being transmitted. The supervisor's heart seemed to stop for a moment. With his experience, he instantly understood how serious this was. Using subtle movements, he quickly opened the recent apps list. On Warasin's phone, a Discord window appeared with the words, "Live now, sharing screen," along with a username he had never seen on the roster of registered players. Within seconds, footage of the match appeared, but it was not the same as the match being played on stage. Every action in the video happened a few seconds before Warasin repeated it on her own device. It was easy to see what was happening. The athlete was not actually playing. She was watching a live stream from another device and mimicking it, pretending she was competing in real time. The supervisor immediately shared this information with other match supervisors, including officials from Laos and the Philippines. However, because the player accused of violating the rules was from the host team, they initially intended to give a warning and let it go. At that moment, a Thai referee spoke up. He refused to stay silent and firmly demanded that an official report be filed against an athlete from his own country in order to uphold fairness in the tournament. Meanwhile, Warasin Naraphat was forced to play properly for the rest of the game. It was unclear whether the drop was due to the psychological pressure of being caught or simply her true skill level, but she finished with a score of only 3.2, the lowest among Thailand's 5 players, and unsurprisingly, the worst out of all 10 players from both Vietnam and Thailand in that match. Throughout the game, Warasin Naraphat wore a pained, irritated expression, sometimes slumping over the desk, sometimes looking like she was about to cry. She looked as if someone were standing behind her with a shock stick, threatening her. After that, in Game 2, Warasin Naraphat was substituted out, but it did not change Thailand's fate. As mentioned earlier, the Land of Smiles team ended up empty-handed after 3 games against Vietnam. By the morning of December 16th, the Thailand Esports Federation issued an official statement declaring that Warasin Naraphat had been disqualified from SEA Games 33 for violating Article 9.4.3 of the SEA Games Technical Handbook, related to using unauthorized third-party software or tampering with hardware. It did not stop there. Garena Rove Thailand also announced a lifetime ban for Tokyogurl from all tournaments organized by Garena. The news immediately sent shockwaves across Southeast Asia. Many streamers and esports viewers also spoke up, saying they had noticed suspicious signs from the athlete while she was still playing long before any official announcement was made. Specifically, they pointed out that right after completing the device check, while most other players were still adjusting their headsets and settling in, Warasin suddenly rotated her phone into portrait mode and performed a rapid sequence of actions, as if she needed to do something quickly before anyone could notice. Perhaps at that moment, she quietly accessed an intermediary app, most likely Discord, to activate a connection with the real player waiting on the other end. After that short sequence of actions, she stood up and asked permission to leave the stage, claiming she needed to use the restroom. What seemed harmless was actually the final link that helped her lock in coordination with an outside accomplice. Before leaving, Warasin also made another controversial move. She deliberately exited the game app entirely on her competition device. This is considered a major taboo in esports because everyone knows that logging back in too close to match time can cause technical issues like a football player waiting until warm-up to go buy their cleats. Experts later analyzed that this force quit may have been intended to erase login traces or deceive the server system, creating an opening for a remote device, the substitute player's device, to access the account without triggering duplicate login alerts. If that is true, then Warasin did not simply prepare a cheating plan, she calculated each step to evade automatic checks by the competition system. When she returned to her seat after a brief absence, Warasin did not reopen the game immediately. Instead, she opened another app so quickly that only those watching very closely would have noticed. It was likely a screen sharing tool, Discord, or another streaming utility serving as a bridge between the phone in her hands and the device that was actually controlling the gameplay. She opened it for only a few seconds, activated what she needed, then shut it down fast, just long enough to establish the signal without drawing attention. Throughout the match, Warasin sat at her station like any other player, but her behavior was calculated and cautious. Her eyes constantly flicked between the screen and the camera zones. She never kept the phone in a fixed position. Instead, she repeatedly adjusted the angle, tilted it slightly, or used a cooling fan to block most of the screen surface. At times, she placed the fan upright, pressed close to the edge of the phone, appearing casual, but in reality, preventing the camera lens from panning over and capturing anything unusual. Every gesture seemed too careful. And in a professional environment, that kind of overcaution is exactly what raises alarms. Some technical officials later admitted they sensed something was off. Warasin always seemed to avoid the cameras, and her hand movements did not fully match what was happening on the match's main display. Those strange behaviors combined with the shady actions before the game ended up exposing a carefully prepared performance. Warasin was not playing directly. She was only mimicking the inputs of someone else controlling the game remotely, like a puppet in front of the camera. And bitterly, despite all the tricks used to conceal the cheating, the final result still could not be saved. Thailand's women's team was completely defeated by Vietnam's women's team, 0-3. It was a loss not only on the scoreboard, but a collapse of honor, trust, and competitive ethics, something every athlete must protect, even more than a medal. And one more point must be mentioned. The tournament's organizational model may have unintentionally created conditions that made this violation possible. Instead of using an internal LAN system like professional tournaments, the Women's Arena of Valor event at this year's SEA Games was played through Thailand's online server, meaning that even though the athletes were seated on stage, they were actually playing over an internet connection like ordinary users. This was a fatal loophole, because with account credentials and a stable connection, someone who was not even at the venue could still log in and play in another person's place. And Warasin saw that weakness and exploited it in a way no one expected. The real player in the match was not Warasin. The competition account under her name was logged into by another individual from outside, possibly from a private home or another location far from the arena. According to multiple sources, it was her boyfriend, also an experienced gamer. That raised another question. If Warasin cheated in the match against Vietnam, what about the earlier matches? Had she used this trick before? And did her teammates or coaches ever suspect her true skill level? In response, the captain of Thailand's Women's Arena of Valor team, Give Mikis, said she had noticed several unusual signs from her teammate Warasin Naraphat right before the fateful match against Vietnam. The first sign appeared when Give Me Kiss was sitting right next to Warasin, and Warasin suddenly made a rather strange request. She asked to borrow Give Me Kiss's competition phone to check in-game items and adjust settings. This made Give Me Kiss uneasy, because every player had their own personal device already configured to standard specifications, so there was no real reason Warasin would need to borrow someone else's phone. When questioned, Warasin gave a brief answer. Her own phone could not connect to the network, a rather flimsy explanation considering all tournament devices had already been set up with a stable network system. Sensing something was off, Give Me Kiss immediately reminded her that borrowing devices during competition required the coach's permission. After the matter was reported, the coach rejected Warasin's request. At that moment, according to Give Me Kiss, Warasin began to look visibly anxious. Her eyes darted around, her voice sounded awkward, and her movements seemed unnatural, clear signs of psychological instability. It was the first time that day Give Me Kiss felt something was quietly going wrong inside the team. Suspicion grew even stronger when players were allowed to step onto the stage to prepare. While everyone else was still settling in, Warasin was the first to stand up and rush toward the competition area, moving hurriedly and somewhat frantically. Give Me Kiss immediately recognized it as unusual. In professional tournaments, players typically go on stage under coordinated direction. No one needs to look impatient or push ahead like that. That proactive move did not reflect confidence. She believed it was a sign of internal pressure, as if Warasin needed to quickly set something up before anyone noticed. And once the match began, everything Give Me Kiss had sensed beforehand seemed to become clearer. Warasin's demeanor while playing looked nothing like what she had shown during practice sessions. She constantly leaned over and adjusted the position of the cooling fan to shield her phone from the camera angle. Whenever the camera panned toward her, Warasin changed posture or lowered her eyes, avoiding direct eye contact. At that moment, Givmikis could not say anything out loud, but inside, every piece of the puzzle had already fallen into place. All the strange actions before the match, from asking to borrow a device, to her tense behavior, to the rush and the concealment, pointed to one thing. Warasin was hiding a secret, and it was not an innocent one. When the truth was finally exposed, the Thailand women's team captain understood that the unease she had felt throughout that match was not paranoia at all. Notably, before this scandal, Warasin Naraphat, 24 years old, was not an unfamiliar name in Thailand's esports community. She was a young female gamer who competed in Arena of Valor on the mobile platform. Ahead of the SEA Games, Warasin played for Talon Esports, one of Thailand's leading esports organizations, and was considered one of the national women's team's promising talents. With an attractive appearance and a confident vibe, she was even labeled by the media as Thailand's esports hot girl, known by the nickname Tokyogurl, drawing attention from many fans. On Instagram and TikTok, she often shared photos of her training and gamer lifestyle, building the image of a modern, distinctive female athlete. At the same time, Warasin was considered fairly skilled within the women's Arena of Valor scene, even though she had not yet achieved any international results. Still, she passed a rigorous selection process to earn a spot on Thailand's roster for SEA Games 33. Wearing the national jersey at a regional multisport event is seen as the greatest honor in any esports athlete's career, and Warasin was no exception. The young woman was expected to be one of the pillars helping Thailand chase gold on home soil. However, instead of making her name through memorable achievements, she destroyed her own career with unsportsmanlike behavior. As a result, Thai public opinion raised many questions about Warasin's selection process. Some teammates and viewers suspected that even during tryouts, she may have used a similar cheating method to fool the coaching staff, so when she was unmasked at the SEA Games, her performance became poor and unconvincing. And as the saying goes, trouble never comes alone. After she was caught cheating and disqualified, more bad news followed. On the same day, December 16th, 2025, Talon Esports, her parent organization, announced it had terminated her status as an esports athlete under the team's roster. In other words, she was fired from the professional squad. Warasin's management company also ended its contract that same day, showing that no organization was willing to tolerate the behavior of the so-called esports hot girl. And it did not end there. After being found using third-party software in the match against Vietnam's women's team, the athlete would be banned from activities under the Thailand Esports Association, and she would also be required to repay all living support funds the association had provided during 9 months of preparation for the tournament, meaning the training allowance from February through November. And so, from a young and promising athlete entrusted with the responsibility of competing at the SEA Games, Warasin Naraphat became the scapegoat of Thai esports. Her entire competitive record is now overshadowed by the stain of cheating. Online, Warasin was forced to lock all of her personal accounts to avoid a wave of fierce backlash. It can be said that her esports career effectively ended after December 16th, 2025, a sad outcome for a once anticipated talent, but also the inevitable consequence of deliberate cheating. Even so, it seemed Warasin Naraphat was trying to dodge public outrage rather than truly recognizing her wrongdoing. During the match, while cameras were broadcasting live, Warasin suddenly raised her middle finger toward the lens of vulgar, unsportsmanlike gesture that left viewers stunned and asking, did that athlete lose her mind to dare do that in front of millions? Although Warasin later claimed it was merely a joke aimed at a friend sitting next to her because she was under intense pressure and that she did not intend to do it for the camera, the clip had already spread widely across Southeast Asia, sparking a wave of anger from the public. What made it worse was that even after being caught red-handed, Warasin Naraphat still tried to argue her way out. She insisted she had done nothing wrong and claimed, if I cheated, I would have beaten Vietnam. On social media, she went on in replies to a fan, how exactly did I cheat? I played by myself, but the psychological pressure made me panic. Plugging in a cable was absolutely not for screen sharing or cheating in any form. Warasin also stubbornly denied having someone else play for her, arguing that the connecting cable was just a normal accessory and did not enable cheating. She even said she fainted after the match and only learned she had been disqualified when she woke up. However, none of Warasin's excuses could change the outcome. The technical evidence clearly showed she had cheated. Even Warasin's teammates did not stand with her. Many were furious at what they saw as her backstabbing the entire team. And then, as the saying goes, winners get crowned, losers end up on an IV drip. In the latest development, Santilo Thong, president of the Thailand Esports Federation, said that Naraphat Warasin had been hospitalized. According to doctors, the athlete was experiencing symptoms such as panic and paranoia. And although she caused a scandal that damaged national pride, she would still receive proper medical care. In the bigger picture, after Naraphat Warasin was caught cheating, Thailand's women's team officially withdrew from SEA Games 33 to show responsibility for what happened. Regarding Warasin's disqualification, recognizing that her violation was serious and that the punishment was clearly defined as immediate removal from the tournament. Disqualification, the Thailand Esports Federation announced it accepted and would comply, with no appeal. The Thai team also said it was conducting a comprehensive internal investigation and raising ethical and technical standards for athletes in order to prevent similar incidents and rebuild trust in Thai esports. Many people are also wondering, beyond competition penalties, could Warasin face criminal prosecution? However, the possibility of this female athlete receiving a long prison sentence would only arise if her conduct fell under one of two key provisions of the criminal code. The first is the Professional Sports Promotion Act of 2013, which addresses match fixing. In that scenario, it would have to be proven that some benefit was offered to manipulate the match result, or that the outcome was fixed for the purpose of betting. But if someone merely uses cheating software to gain an advantage, without evidence of financial transactions or concrete benefits, it typically does not meet the legal definition of match fixing. Another angle is the Computer Crime Act, which requires a detailed assessment of the technical facts, specifically whether the software involved cyber attacks or unauthorized access to the central server, or whether it led to the destruction or alteration of system data. Indeed, the account that played on Warasin's behalf did involve unauthorized access to the tournament system. But if it was simply a third-party program installed on the substitute player's device to play in her place, without actually interfering with the competition's main system, then there would not be enough evidence to prosecute under that charge. In short, given the current situation, the cheating scandal at SEA Games 33 will likely end as a career death sentence for Naraphat Warasin, and nothing more. So far, there have been no reports or signs from relevant authorities indicating that criminal charges will be filed. Because to convict someone and send them to prison, prosecutors need clearer elements of commercial fraud, intent, or actual harm to a computer system, not merely a rules violation to gain an unfair advantage in a game. In any case, losing her entire career is already considered the harshest punishment in the sports world for Warasin. Thai athletes have also been deeply embarrassed by the scandal, even though they were not the main culprit. FZK Frozen Kiss, one of the early legends of Thailand's Arena of Valor scene, posted angrily on social media, "You're already on the national team, why would you still cheat? People can't even accept this in a small tournament, let alone the SEA Games." Honestly, I feel incredibly ashamed right now, because people who once competed alongside me are now being labeled as cheaters at the national team level. From now on, how will people look at Thailand's women's players? How can you damage an entire country's reputation and trample on other people's hard work and effort like that? From another perspective, Warasin's cheating only made Vietnam's dominant victory look even more absolute. After that, our girls easily defeated Laos in the grand final to win a highly convincing gold medal. Many people even joked Thailand had someone play for them and still lost proof that Vietnam's women's level is simply on another tier across Southeast Asia. What do you think about the actions of this esports hot girl from the land of smiles? On the afternoon of December 12, 2002, Gate C-22 of Changi Airport's Terminal 1 remained as lively as usual. Among the passengers was a young Asian-faced man making a transit stop before boarding Qantas flight QF10 to Melbourne, scheduled to depart at 8:15 p.m. As he passed through the security checkpoint at around 7:45 p.m., the alarm suddenly went off. A female security officer approached with a handheld scanner, sweeping it across his body but finding no metal object. However, when she touched the lower back of the passenger, she immediately felt an unusual bulge beneath his clothing. Remaining calm, she asked, "What is this?" The passenger, visibly startled, shook his head and said, "No." Sensing clear suspicion, the security team escorted the man to an inspection room and confiscated his backpack and carry-on bag. Inside the private screening room, a male officer instructed Van to raise his hands against the wall for a body check. Surprisingly, he did not resist, he fully cooperated. He slowly lifted his shirt and turned around, revealing a large plastic bundle tightly wrapped with yellow and white tape strapped to his lower back. When asked, "What is this?" the man bowed his head and admitted, "Heroin, sir." Moments later, he burst into tears and attempted to bang his head against the wall in panic. Officers tried to help him calm down. A few minutes later, once he regained control, one officer asked whether he had anything else in his luggage. Without hesitation, the man said yes, retrieved another plastic bundle from his backpack, and handed it over. His cooperation left officers both stunned and somewhat sympathetic toward his unusual behavior. Unlike many hardened traffickers, this young man, after his initial panic, voluntarily surrendered all contraband. Immediately after, airport security notified the Airport Drug Enforcement Team of Singapore's Central Narcotics Bureau, CNB. CNB officers arrived at 9:10 p.m. and took over the scene and evidence. The two powder-filled bundles were sealed and sent for analysis. Each one measured around 3 to 4 centimeters thick, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic and tightly sealed with yellow tape. Laboratory analysis revealed that the packages contained a total of 396.2 grams of pure heroin, about 151.5 grams in the bundle taped to his back, and 244.7 grams in the bundle inside the backpack. Although this amount was roughly equivalent to the weight of a single soda can, it could produce 26,000 doses of illegal drugs, 26 times higher than Singapore's 15-gram threshold for the death penalty. With such a shocking discovery, the veteran officers at the airport knew the young man's legal fate was almost sealed. Yet his behavior puzzled them. Instead of denying his crime or attempting to conceal the evidence, he voluntarily surrendered the drugs and fully cooperated. He continued crying uncontrollably and fell into complete distress the moment he was arrested, showing none of the hardened traits of an experienced trafficker. Regardless, the criminal case was formally opened. The passenger was handcuffed and escorted to CNB headquarters at the Central Police Station for interrogation that same night. From the identification documents he carried, police learned that he was Nguyen Tuong Van, an Australian citizen of Vietnamese origin born in 1980 with no prior criminal history. Still, his motive and the circumstances leading to such a reckless act remained a major question, much like the mystery behind the two taped bundles of white powder seized from him. At the station, when officers examined Van's backpack and bag, they found a stash of items, including 9 counterfeit wristwatches, mimicking luxury brands, and 10 brand new leather belts. Van explained that these were souvenirs he had bought in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, to give to friends as Christmas gifts. He also carried 2 mobile phones, a Nokia and a Siemens, along with a Sony laptop borrowed from a friend. On his person, police collected loose currency totaling roughly 100 Australian dollars, consisting of Cambodian, Vietnamese, Singaporean, Australian, and US money, likely leftover spending cash from his trip. Notably, in his wallet was a small slip of paper with a phone number in Australia beginning with +04, matching the number Van identified as belonging to the mastermind who had drawn him into the scheme. Investigators quickly traced Van's travel history. He had entered Singapore on December 6, 2002 on a flight from Phnom Penh and was scheduled to fly onward to Melbourne on December 12th. This meant Van had spent about a week in Cambodia. At the airport, he was alone, with no accomplice in sight. This raised 2 possibilities. Either Van was a lone courier working for an international smuggling network, or he was acting entirely on his own. Remaining cooperative, Van said that a man named Sun had contacted him by phone and hired him to take the packages to Melbourne. Remarkably, Van did not know who the recipient would be. Sun told him that the contact would recognize Van first and initiate the exchange using the phrase, "I like basketball." So, did Van know he was carrying illegal drugs? The answer was yes, though he said he could not distinguish the type because he had never used drugs himself. And the reason he became entangled in this scheme was heartbreaking. Van told investigators he had a twin brother named Nguyen in Melbourne, and it was Koa who pushed him into this desperate situation. More importantly, a few years earlier, Koa had faced criminal charges for drug possession and assault, leaving him with heavy legal fees and debts. Out of love for his brother, Van dropped out of university to work and pay for Koa's legal costs. But before the old debts were resolved, Koa accumulated new debts with organized crime, leading both brothers to be threatened by gangsters. Under that pressure, Van made the desperate decision to accept a drug courier job to earn money and save his brother. This information made even the most seasoned investigators pause, as it appeared that Nguyen Tuong Van was both a perpetrator and a victim, driven by love for his family and reckless desperation. Knowing Van's family was struggling financially, a man named Tan in Melbourne introduced him to a quick money job in November 2002. At first, Van did not know what the job was. He only vaguely heard that he would need to travel overseas. Later, in Sydney, a man named Sun made a direct offer to hire Van to transport heroin from Asia to Australia for a very large payout. Desperate and needing money to pay his brother's debts, Van agreed, unable to grasp the full consequences he would face. Sun then arranged Van's round-trip airfare from Australia to Cambodia, covered his hotel expenses, and gave him $1,000 up front as spending money. On December 3rd, 2002, Van departed Sydney, transited through Singapore, and flew to Phnom Penh. There, he received 2 packages of heroin, one strapped to his lower back and the other hidden in his backpack, before preparing to return to Australia via Singapore. Van admitted that he was terrified, but the traffickers had threatened to harm his family in Melbourne if he failed or ran off with the drugs. When arrested at Changi Airport, Van said he feared for his family's safety, yet also felt strangely relieved that he no longer had to continue committing the crime. These sincere statements offered the first glimpses of a young man trapped between debt, threats, and the lure of quick cash. However, confessions alone were insufficient. Police needed independent verification. Digital forensics experts were brought in to extract data from Van's 2 mobile phones and borrowed Sony laptop. The results showed that apart from a mysterious text, "Checked out now," sent to Van on December 3rd, there was nothing suspicious. The number was traced to a prepaid Australian SIM, likely used and discarded by Sun, making it impossible to identify him. Singaporean police then worked with the Australian Federal Police to investigate the 2 figures known as Sun and Tan, but with such limited information, both remained ghost-like. Changi Airport's CCTV footage was reviewed and confirmed Van was traveling alone, with no escort or helper. This strengthened the theory that he was merely a lone courier. In Van's travel timeline, only one person had contact with him, his Singaporean friend, Golgan, who met him during transit on December 3rd while Van was on his way to Cambodia. During questioning, Golgan confirmed they only made casual conversation and that he knew nothing about the drug operation. Thus, no witness or accomplice could help uncover a larger network. Because the suspect was a foreign citizen, Singapore was obligated to follow Article 36 of the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, meaning the Australian embassy or consulate had to be notified of his arrest and allowed access to him as soon as possible. But in reality, Van had been interrogated throughout the night of December 12th and the day of December 13th, while the Australian side was only notified in the late afternoon of December 13th. Van's defense later argued that the delay in consular access violated procedure, but the court dismissed this claim, stating that consular rights were granted before the investigation concluded and that all of Van's statements had been made voluntarily. Across 4 recorded statements, Van clearly described the events, from meeting Tan to receiving the drugs and being arrested. His statements were consistent and logically coherent, and the court accepted them as a full confession under Singapore's evidentiary rules. Notably, in the statement dated December 19th, 2002, Van expressed deep remorse and admitted all elements of the offense. As for further investigation, Singaporean authorities collaborated with Australian police, but could not arrest anyone else. Sun remained an unidentified phantom, and although authorities checked for a man named Tan in Melbourne, no actionable leads were found. There were indications that Australian police once considered the option of setting up a sting operation by asking Singapore to release Van so he could continue his journey, allowing authorities to follow him to the recipient in Melbourne and capture the entire network. However, Singapore firmly refused, unwilling to gamble national security on such an experiment. Furthermore, Singaporean law at the time imposed a mandatory death sentence for trafficking large quantities of illegal drugs, leaving no mechanism for sentence reduction in exchange for cooperation. In fact, the court acknowledged that Van had cooperated extensively, providing all information and contact numbers linked to the case, but existing law simply did not allow for a lighter sentence based solely on that. In March 2004, the case went to trial before the High Court of Singapore. Proceedings were swift because the defendant had already pleaded guilty. Van was represented by defense lawyer Joseph Thesaira and assistant Tito Isaac, while two deputy public prosecutors represented the state. In court, Van appeared calm, though resigned. He confirmed that he had carried 396 grams of heroin through the airport, but lawyer Thesaira immediately presented three main arguments in his defense. First, he argued that the mandatory death penalty under Singapore's Misuse of Drugs Act was unconstitutional, conflicting with Article 9, Right to Life, and Article 12, Right to Equal Protection, of the Singapore Constitution. They contended that an inflexible punishment that ignored all mitigating circumstances amounted to a cruel and arbitrary deprivation of life. However, the panel of judges, led by Chief Justice Yong Pung Hao, rejected this argument, citing legal precedent that mandatory capital punishment did not violate the Constitution and had been clearly established by Parliament. Second, the defense argued that Van's statements during the investigation might not have been entirely voluntary because he was not granted early consular access. They referenced the Vienna Convention and requested the court to exclude some statements made before the Australian consul met Van on the afternoon of December 13th. However, Justice Kan Ting Chiu ruled that there had been no serious violation. He reasoned that even if consular notification had been delayed by 20 hours, this did not render the statements coerced or unreliable. In reality, Van had signed each page of his statements, and even his defense lawyer admitted that police had not threatened or mistreated him during questioning. Third, the defense focused on Van's unique circumstances, that he was a first-time courier pressured into the role and not acting for personal profit. They hoped the court would consider humanitarian factors in seeking leniency. The lawyer also submitted multiple letters requesting clemency from Van's family, friends, and even a church bishop. However, Justice Kan Ting Chiu firmly stated that the law did not allow personal circumstances to be considered for this offense. He explained that anyone caught importing more than 15 grams of heroin into Singapore faced only one possible punishment: death. In other words, the court's job was merely to determine whether the accused had committed the crime. Once guilt was established, the death sentence was mandatory. Thus, on March 20th, 2004, the court convicted Nguyen Tuong Van of importing 396.2 grams of heroin and sentenced him to death. When the verdict was read, Van remained silent, showing little emotion except for the redness in his eyes. He seemed mentally prepared for this moment. He then turned toward his crying mother and nodded gently, as if trying to comfort her. Legally, the death sentence was unsurprising, as it was a statutory requirement. But it marked the beginning of a long battle for his family and the Australian government to try to save his life. Van immediately filed an appeal to the Court of Appeal of Singapore. On October 20th, 2004, the appeal was heard by a panel of 3 senior judges. Lawyer Thesaira continued to argue on constitutional and procedural grounds, hoping to overturn the sentence. He cited international law and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but the court responded that international norms could not override domestic law. Regarding the constitutionality of mandatory capital punishment, the Court of Appeal maintained its position that no violation existed. Thus, in its decision on October 21st, 2004, the court upheld the death sentence for Nguyen Tuong Van, affirming that Singaporean law did not allow judges to consider humanitarian factors in such cases. With all domestic legal avenues closed, the unfortunate young man had no remaining options in Singapore. Yet outside, Van's family and the Australian government continued fighting until the very last moment. In January 2005, both the Governor General of Australia and the Australian Prime Minister sent letters requesting clemency for Van to Singapore's President Selapan Nathan. In February 2005, Australian Prime Minister John Howard personally met Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong on the sidelines of a regional summit and brought up Van's case. Howard later recounted that he had told Singapore directly that the Australian public cared deeply about the matter and hoped the Singaporean government would consider humanitarian grounds. But Prime Minister Lee responded only that the case was being reviewed carefully at all levels. In reality, Singapore's cabinet had held several sessions to discuss Nguyen Tuong Van's clemency request. Under Singapore's procedure, ministers deliberate and then advise the president. Media reports stated that although Singapore sympathized with Van's circumstances, they feared setting a dangerous precedent if they showed leniency toward foreign drug offenders. Singapore also faced internal pressure, as a large majority of its citizens supported the death penalty for drug trafficking and did not want the government to appear lenient under foreign political pressure. As a result, all efforts gradually became futile. On October 21, 2005, Singapore's Ministry of Home Affairs issued an official letter denying Nguyen Tuong Van's clemency petition. Van's family in Melbourne was devastated by the news. Australian Prime Minister John Howard somberly stated on television that this was a stark reminder of how harsh Asian drug laws could be. He affirmed that the Australian government had done everything within its power, but Singapore maintained a firm stance. On November 17, 2005, Van's family received another letter from Singapore informing them that the execution date had been set for December 2, 2005. This meant that the condemned prisoner had less than half a month left to live. His mother, Kim Nguyen, and his twin brother, Koa, immediately flew to Singapore. They brought religious images and numerous letters from relatives. Upon seeing her son in prison, Mrs. Kim collapsed in tears, begging to take his place. But after nearly 3 years behind bars, Van had found composure and instead became a source of strength for his mother. In his final days, he joined Catholic catechism classes in prison, was baptized, and received the Christian name Caleb. Priests stated that Van had found peace in his faith, repeatedly encouraging his mother to stay strong so he could leave without regret. Meanwhile, public opinion in Australia remained deeply divided. A nationwide poll showed that 47% of Australians supported carrying out the execution, while 46% opposed it. One side believed Singapore's laws had to be respected. The other argued that the death penalty was inhumane. Tensions rose sharply, especially within the Vietnamese community and among Catholic groups who organized large prayer campaigns for Van. Some groups even called for protests and boycotts against Singapore Airlines and the Optus Telecommunications Company, reflecting the anger among parts of the Australian public. The Australian government found itself caught between domestic pressure and diplomatic relations, but ultimately reaffirmed that it would not retaliate against Singapore, prioritizing stable bilateral ties above all. On November 26th, Prime Minister Howard also met privately with Van's mother to comfort her and listen to the family's final wishes. The last request made by the Australian side was to allow Van's mother to embrace him one last time before the execution. Under Changi prison regulations, all physical contact with death row inmates was strictly prohibited. Visits were conducted only through a glass partition. However, this being an exceptional case, internal debate ensued. On November 29th and 30th of 2005, Singapore's High Commissioner to Australia, Joseph Koh, repeatedly appeared on Australian media to explain Singapore's position. He said he was deeply moved by the mother's grief, but emphasized that the law must be applied equally to both foreigners and Singaporean citizens. He stressed that this strictness had saved countless families from the devastation caused by illegal drugs, and expressed hope that Australians would respect Singapore's legislative sovereignty. Regarding the final contact request, Mr. Koh said the Singaporean government had considered it on humanitarian grounds. On the afternoon of December 1st, 2005, Singapore announced that Nguyen Tuong Van would be allowed to hold hands with his mother and brother one last time. Although an embrace was not permitted, the permission to hold hands was an unprecedented exception in the country's history. That night, the final night before the execution, soft candlelight appeared outside Changi prison. A A small group of young people and several Singaporean activists stood at a distance, holding candles in silent prayer for Van. At the same time, in major churches across Melbourne, Sydney, and Canberra, thousands of Australians gathered to hold candlelight vigils. Outside Australia's Parliament House in Canberra, hundreds held signs bearing anguished questions directed at Singapore. At dawn on December 2nd, 2005, the sky over Singapore was still dark. In his death row cell, Nguyen Tuong Van awoke at 5 in the morning. He washed himself carefully and put on the nicest clothes his family had sent him for one final photograph. He was then escorted down the cold corridors of the death row wing. Walking beside him were lawyer Julian McMahon and his brother Kwa, who could not enter the execution chamber but were permitted to follow him up to its door. Koa struggled to hold back tears, whispering prayers under his breath. At exactly 6 o'clock, Nguyen Tuong Van was taken into the execution chamber. The room fell silent as the officer in charge asked him for his final words. Van took a deep breath and clearly said that he apologized to his mother and family, thanked the Australian government and everyone who had tried to help him, and asked God for forgiveness. His voice trembled. After that, the procedures proceeded as scheduled. Van's time of death was recorded as 6:06 a.m. on December 2nd, 2005. After the execution, the body of Nguyen Tuong Van was lowered and handed over to the authorities. In an unexpected and rare humanitarian gesture, Singapore allowed Mrs. Kim Nguyen to see her son one final time before the body was taken away. Lawyer Julian McMahon recalled with emotion that she was permitted to touch his face and stroke his hair one last time, which brought her immense comfort. Perhaps the prison wished to ease the pain of a mother enduring unimaginable loss. At 7:17 in the morning, the prison doctor signed the certificate confirming that Nguyen Tuong Van had passed away. As dawn broke over Singapore, it marked the end of that fateful Friday morning. News of Van's execution quickly spread across the world. In Melbourne, the bells of St. Ignatius Church rang 25 times, each toll symbolizing a year of his life. Hundreds attending the service broke into tears. The presiding priest said that the congregation was praying not only for the soul of Caleb, Van's baptismal name, but also for those who had to make the decision to carry out the sentence. In Canberra, the flag atop Parliament House was lowered to half-mast in remembrance. Prime Minister John Howard, his eyes visibly red, told the press that it was a sad day and that he hoped young Australians would learn a vital lesson: never become involved with illicit substances, not even once. In reality, the Australian government treated the case of Nguyen Tuong Van as a powerful warning to its citizens about the severe consequences of drug-related crimes in Asia. On Singapore's side, the aftermath of this case also forced lawmakers to reconsider their approach. By the year 2012, Singapore officially passed legal amendments, allowing courts to impose life imprisonment instead of mandatory death sentences for drug couriers acting merely as mules, provided they cooperated with investigations or suffered from mental disorders. In other words, starting from the year 2013, judges were able to spare individuals in situations similar to that of Nguyen Tuong Van from the death penalty. Unfortunately, this change came too late for him. Nevertheless, it became a form of indirect legacy of his case, helping save the lives of others in later years. In fact, another well-known death row inmate, Yang Vui Kong from Malaysia, arrested in the year 2007 for trafficking heroin, benefited from the new law, and had his sentence reduced to life imprisonment in the year 2013, narrowly escaping death. And what about you? What do you think about the controversial death sentence in this case? Should such a rigid punishment exist even when the offender has shown remorse and cooperated fully? In June 2019, the Fitchburg Police Department received a report from a young woman. Over the phone, she described something almost unbelievable. A state senator had taken a gun and threatened her elderly aunt. As soon as the information was received, Fitchburg police officers and investigators arrived at the scene. It was the small home of a widowed woman. The first thing they saw was the front door left slightly ajar, with the lock showing signs of forced tampering. The homeowner was still shaken, her thin hands trembling as she gripped her granddaughter's shoulders. In panic, she kept repeating the name Dean Tran, leaving the officers stunned because that was the name of a sitting state senator. As they moved deeper inside, the scene revealed even clearer clues. The family gun safe, located in a workroom at the back of the house, had been left wide open. Inside, the other firearms were still there, except for one unusually empty space. The woman pointed to it, sobbing, and said that her husband's Colt .45 was missing. According to the victim's statement, she was 70 years old and the widow of a veteran who had served in World War II. After her husband passed away, she had to manage the house and all of the couple's shared property on her own, including the gun collection her husband left behind. Because she knew little about firearms, she always felt anxious about keeping them in the house. However, instead of turning the guns over to the police herself, she thought of asking State Senator Dean Tran for help, someone she had voted for as her representative and a familiar face at community events. He agreed to come to her home and introduced himself as someone who could help take care of the guns in a safe way. According to the victim, that day, Dean Tran used his personal influence to persuade her to sign a contract transferring all of her late husband's firearms to him in exchange for $1,500 in cash. However, by that evening, she began to regret it when she realized the amount was far too little compared with the collection's true value. She called and asked Dean to return the firearms, hoping to keep them as her last mementos of her husband. The senator agreed. True to his word, early the next morning, he brought 8 guns back to her home. She thought the matter had ended peacefully, but the widow did not expect that only a few hours after returning the guns, Dean Tran would suddenly come back. According to her account, at around dawn, while she was home alone, Dean abruptly stormed straight inside. He forced her to hand over the key to the gun safe, acting aggressively, completely different from the calm demeanor he had shown the day before. Terrified, she rushed to her bedroom, shut the door tightly, and hid inside, but she could still hear Dean Tran rummaging around outside. When the house finally went quiet, she cautiously stepped out to check and discovered that the Colt .45, a keepsake tied to her late husband, had vanished from the safe. These initial details quickly helped investigators sketch out a brazen scenario. An elected official was suspected of exploiting trust to seize property from his own constituent. If the statement was accurate, this was not merely an ordinary legal violation, but a serious betrayal of public service ethics. Police then urgently collected evidence, including fingerprints around the safe and the entryway, as well as the contract bearing Dean Tran's signature. That same morning, Fitchburg police also contacted the Massachusetts Attorney General's office to report everything. Immediately after receiving the case, the Massachusetts Attorney General's office formally opened an investigation. Because the named individual was a sitting state senator, the file was transferred to the Public Corruption and Integrity Unit. Seasoned investigators quickly began interviewing witnesses and gathering and reviewing relevant records. In terms of physical evidence, the gun sale contract was considered a key detail in the case. It contained Dean Tran's signature, the victim's signature, and a list of 8 firearms being transferred. This document indicated that Dean Tran had directly participated in the transaction involving those weapons. Even if he claimed it was a lawful agreement, the legality of the transaction was still questioned, because private firearm sales must comply with strict licensing procedures. At the same time, forensic officers collected fingerprints and footwear impressions from inside the house. Forensic results later showed that Dean Tran's fingerprints matched the prints found on the gun safe and around the entryway, confirming his presence at the scene at the time the incident occurred. However, when police contacted the suspect, Dean Tran, through his attorney, issued a statement insisting he was completely innocent and willing to cooperate with investigators. Even so, investigators noted that during the first interview, Dean was evasive and repeatedly contradicted himself. At first, he denied any gun-related transaction and claimed the elderly woman had fabricated the story. When shown the contract bearing his own signature, Dean shifted to admitting he had purchased the firearms, but insisted it was merely an act of helping the victim and that there had been no coercion. As for what happened the next morning, Dean continued to deny it, claiming there had been no break-in and no gun taken as alleged. He even implied the victim was not mentally sound, and that this was why she made such accusations. During follow-up investigation, police executed a court-authorized search of Dean Tran's home and office. The goal was to find the missing Colt .45, but no physical evidence was recovered. Later, investigators determined that once Dean realized he was under intense scrutiny, he quietly returned the gun to the victim through an intermediary a few weeks after the incident. This ensured the Colt was recovered safely, but it also suggested he had attempted to conceal his actions. The investigative team also found inaccuracies in the gun license renewal paperwork that Dean Tran submitted in May 2019. Specifically, he failed to disclose that he had just purchased additional firearms under the contract with the victim, an omission considered a false statement on an official document and a violation of firearm regulations. It did not stop there. Evidence also showed that after the incident became public, Dean had sent a letter to the victim demanding that she write an apology letter. In that letter, he subtly pressured her, suggesting that she was the reason his reputation had been damaged and that she should be held responsible for it. Piece by piece, these details formed a clearer picture. Dean Tran had exploited the trust of an innocent citizen for personal gain, and when his reputation was threatened, he tried to cover up his conduct while shifting blame onto the victim. The investigation then lasted for more than 2 years, largely because Dean was still a sitting official, requiring the legal process to proceed with extreme caution. In November 2020, Dean Tran ran for re-election to the state Senate but lost, surrendering the seat to a Democratic opponent. After leaving the state Senate, he pivoted to a run for the U.S. House of Representatives in the 2022 election. But right in the middle of that congressional campaign, on July 1st, 2022, a Worcester County grand jury formally indicted Dean Tran on a series of criminal charges related to the incident involving the elderly woman's gun. The grand jury indictment listed a total of 6 charges, including taking a firearm, i.e., larceny of property valued over $250 from a person over 60 years old, making false statements on a gun license renewal application, fraudulently obtaining a signature, providing false information to police during the investigation, and obtaining property by confinement or threats. These charges underscored the seriousness of the case, especially the count related to obtaining property by inducing fear, indicating that prosecutors viewed the act of coercing the elderly woman inside her home as violent in nature, closer to robbery than ordinary theft. When the indictment was made public, Dean Tran immediately denied all allegations. He appeared at Worcester Superior Court on July 28, 2022 for arraignment and entered a not guilty plea to every charge. Earlier, Dean posted on his personal Facebook page that the allegations were completely false and claimed the timing of the indictment was politically motivated. He argued that Attorney General Maura Healey, a Democrat, had deliberately tried to disadvantage him by undermining his congressional campaign, thereby helping his opponent, Lori Trahan. Not stopping there, Dean quickly filed a federal lawsuit against Healey, accusing her of abusing prosecutorial power for political purposes. In response to these claims, Healey's office declined to comment, citing the principle of not discussing cases pending trial. Despite Dean's denials and legal complaints, prosecutors and the court remained determined to bring the matter to light. However, due to the complexity of the case file, the criminal trial over the gun incident was not scheduled to be heard until 2025. While awaiting his court date, Dean Tran continued running for Congress and lost in November 2022 before facing another legal storm, this time at the federal level, over alleged fraud involving pandemic relief benefits. Specifically, Federal Department of Labor inspectors reviewed the records and found a period in which Dean Tran received unemployment benefits while still having significant income at the same time. Tracing the information on the benefit application, they identified leads connected to Dean's sister's company, Tuet T. Martin, and also uncovered emails between the two discussing a job offer letter with multiple suspicious details. Investigators, therefore, determined that when the COVID-19 pandemic erupted in early 2020, Dean Tran, despite being entangled in an ethics scandal at the state Senate, still did not miss an opportunity to profit financially from the government's relief programs. In January 2021, Dean Tran officially left the state Senate after losing the election. Once he was no longer receiving a salary, he began looking for ways to take advantage of emergency relief packages. Dean knew that at the time, the government was implementing pandemic unemployment assistance for people who had lost income due to COVID. Even though he had just completed his term and did not meet the usual definition of unemployment, he still sought a way to claim a portion of those funds. To pull this off, Dean constructed a fairly sophisticated scheme. He asked his sister, Tuet T. Martin, the owner of a food company in New Hampshire, to create a fake job offer letter. The letter stated that Martin's company had offered to hire Dean Tran, but for objective reasons he was unable to accept the position. The purpose of this letter was to prove that Dean had lost a job opportunity due to the impact of the pandemic. He edited the document and backdated it, and even forged his sister's signature to make the file look legitimate. With this carefully prepared set of false paperwork, Dean Tran submitted an application for benefits, claiming he had lost income and could not take a new job because he had to care for a young child during the pandemic. In reality, shortly after leaving the state Senate, Dean found paid consulting work for an auto parts business in New Hampshire. Throughout that period, he collected consulting pay while also receiving weekly COVID-related unemployment benefits. By the end of 2021, Dean Tran had received a total of $30,120 in federal unemployment benefits. Not only that, when filing his 2021 tax return, he also concealed $54,700 in income earned from the auto parts company. When she realized authorities were starting to pay attention to the case, Martin panicked and deleted certain emails related to arranging the job offer letter. However, digital forensics specialists later recovered the deleted data. In November 2023, the FBI arrested Dean Tran under a federal indictment containing 28 charges related to COVID benefits, fraud, and tax evasion. Around the same time, the FBI also arrested Tuong T. Martin in New Hampshire, charging her with 2 counts of obstruction of justice and 1 count of making false statements for providing false information to federal investigators and destroying evidence, namely the related emails. Once again, the public was left stunned. It turned out that beyond the gun incident, Dean Tran was also accused of quietly siphoning off relief funds during a period when many people were struggling desperately because of the pandemic. What stands out is that before becoming entangled in this string of scandals, Dean Tran had lived a relatively impressive life, with countless achievements in his career. Dean Tran was born in 1975 in Vietnam, moved to the United States with his family as a child, and grew up in Massachusetts. He graduated from Brandeis University in 1997, then built his life and career in the city of Fitchburg. Dean began his political path at the local level, serving as a Fitchburg city councilor before winning election to the Massachusetts State Senate in 2017 in a special election. He represented the Worcester and Middlesex district and served as an assistant minority leader in the Senate from 2018 to 2020. As the first Vietnamese American to enter the state legislature, Dean Tran was once expected to bring a diverse and fresh voice to Massachusetts politics. In his personal life, Dean Tran was married and had 4 children, and he was also often known as someone who emphasized traditional family values. In the eyes of supporters, he was once seen as a model example of a successful immigrant. However, behind that somewhat glossy image, many colleagues described Dean Tran's personality as containing plenty of contradictions. He was regarded as intelligent and politically sharp, but also competitive and rather impulsive. A report released in 2020 by the Senate Ethics Committee noted that Dean's office operated in a disorderly manner without clearly separating public duties from personal matters. Many staff members said they often felt uncertain, unsure whether they were carrying out official public work or doing personal tasks for their boss. In fact, in March 2020, the Massachusetts Senate Ethics Committee concluded that Dean Tran had violated the rules by using his office staff to participate in campaign activities during work hours. This led to him being stripped of a low-level leadership position, and he was also barred from direct contact with staff, with all communication restricted to official work email only. Notably, Dean later asked the state's highest court to overturn the matter, arguing that he had legislative immunity for actions alleged to have occurred while he was serving as a senator. However, in September 2025, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court rejected that argument and affirmed that he still had to face the criminal legal process. That detail suggested Dean Tran had a tendency to downplay the law, believing his political status could shield him from legal responsibility. After witnessing scandal after scandal, many of Dean Tran's former supporters were left deeply bitter and disappointed. They once saw him as a devoted father and a dedicated public servant. But over time, layer after layer of the facade was peeled away, revealing Dean Tran, in the end, as a fallen politician willing to break the law for personal gain and then trying to deny responsibility while blaming others and even the system itself. Dean Tran's case unfolded across multiple legal fronts, but the public's attention remained focused on the federal trial in late 2024 over benefits, fraud, along with the state court proceedings scheduled for 2025. At the federal trial in September 2024, Dean's defense attorney tried to portray him as a victim of political maneuvering, emphasizing that he had once been an opponent of multiple Democratic officials. On that basis, they argued the case was politically motivated and that the amount of money allegedly involved was insignificant compared with many other cases. They also insisted that Dean did not realize he was breaking the law because he believed he was eligible to receive the benefits. However, these arguments did not persuade the court. After 6 days of proceedings, the jury reached a unanimous verdict, finding Dean Tran guilty on all 23 counts, including 20 fraud counts and 3 counts of filing false tax returns. The outcome left Dean deeply dissatisfied. Soon afterward, in December 2024, he posted on his personal Facebook page calling on President Donald Trump to consider granting him a pardon. However, the appeal received no response and quickly faded, partly because Dean Tran's case did not carry a clearly political character, and partly because a president would have little ability to intervene in sentences under state jurisdiction. In February 2025, a federal court in Boston sentenced Dean Tran to 18 months in prison and 2 years of supervised release. He was ordered to repay $25,100 to the Massachusetts Department of Unemployment Assistance and $23,327 to the Internal Revenue Service, and to pay an additional $7,500 fine. At sentencing, Dean remained defiant, declaring he would appeal to the end and insisting there had been no fraud or misappropriation. In court, he continued to attack the investigation, claiming that the law was being turned into a political tool, and insisting he was targeted solely because of political disagreements. Even so, the judge emphasized that an 18-month prison term was necessary as a deterrent, because no one is above the law, not even those who once held public office. Regarding the gun theft case, on June 2, 2025, Dean Tran agreed to plead guilty under a deal with prosecutors. He admitted to 3 charges: taking a firearm, witness intimidation, and making false statements on a firearms license application. In exchange, the more serious charges were withdrawn. The judge sentenced Dean Tran to 6 months in jail for each charge, but the sentences were to run concurrently and be served at the same time as the federal sentence he was already serving. In practice, this meant Dean would not have to serve additional jail time after completing the 18-month federal term, but his record would reflect an additional state-level criminal conviction. Even so, Dean Tran's legal troubles were not entirely over. As mentioned earlier, he still faced another case related to conflict of interest violations after being accused of using state employees for campaign activities. The criminal trial in Suffolk County is expected to be held in 2026. This means that even after serving his federal prison sentence and pleading guilty at the state level, Dean Tran still has to enter one final legal battle. And in the view of legal experts, if he is convicted in this case, he could continue to face additional penalties. As for his sister, Tuet Martin, she is also firmly denied the obstruction of justice and false statement charges, so her case was separated for a separate trial. By the end of 2025, Dean Tran had expressed an intention to plead guilty in the matter involving his sister in exchange for leniency, while Martin chose to go to trial to defend her name. Her trial is expected to take place in January 2026 and is believed to reveal further details about how the siblings attempted to cover their tracks. Dean Tran's case became a resounding wake-up call for the public in Massachusetts. On one hand, it enraged the public and gradually eroded trust in politicians. As someone who once swore to serve the people could profit from the very vulnerable, from taking property from a lonely elderly woman to siphoning off relief funds during the pandemic that were meant for workers who had lost their jobs. Dean Tran's downfall also left many of his former supporters deeply bitter. In particular, the Vietnamese community in Massachusetts, which had once placed so much hope and pride in him, felt an even sharper sense of disappointment. Across the press and social media, countless voices condemned him harshly, calling Dean Tran bottomlessly greedy, a disgrace to the Vietnamese community, and a betrayer of his oath of office. In the end, the case closed on the image of Dean Tran leaving the courthouse in an orange prison uniform, hands cuffed, eyes vacant. That image stood in stark contrast to the day he took his oath of office, back when he wore a neat suit and solemnly pledged to serve the people. A quiet early morning in Dalat was shattered by the footsteps of dozens of police officers. Moving through thin fog, authorities surrounded a two-story rental house that looked no different from any other home in the peaceful neighborhood. Inside, a group of young people were deeply focused on their computer and phone screens. No one spoke, yet every movement was synchronized like a perfectly tuned machine. They silently cycled massive amounts of money, numbers flashing non-stop on the screens, transfer confirmations popping up as though pre-programmed. Few would believe that behind this facade was a cross-border money laundering operation, handling transactions worth tens of millions of dollars per day. The case exposed not only the sophisticated tricks of digital-age financial criminals, but also the chilling truth hidden behind seemingly harmless digits. It all began in early 2025, when police in Lamdong province noticed unusual patterns. More than 20 young people from various provinces suddenly gathered in Dalat and jointly rented a large villa deep inside Tu Tao Street, Ward 11. Their isolated lifestyle and lack of interaction, a strange sight in a friendly tourist town, immediately drew the attention of local authorities. Even more suspicious, none of them registered their temporary residence. At the same time, commercial banks flagged an abnormal spike in transactions, large sums constantly flowing in and out of accounts belonging to individuals with no identifiable occupation. Alerts were sent to the cybercrime division, and all the signs pointed to Dalat. A covert investigation was launched. Working under the radar, surveillance teams mapped the network, identified each member, and confirmed that the villa was the operations command center. After weeks of monitoring, the moment to strike finally arrived. At dawn on the 12th of March 2025, the takedown operation began. More than 50 officers from criminal investigation units, mobile, forces, cybersecurity teams, and local police surrounded the villa. Though the house was equipped with remote surveillance cameras and a reinforced steel gate, none of it mattered against the determination of the task force. When the signal was given, the door was kicked open and officers stormed inside. Caught completely off guard, the group had no time to react. A few panicked and tried to slam laptops shut, smash phones, or tear documents, but within seconds, all were restrained. Police seized a large amount of evidence: phones, laptops, storage devices, lists of bank accounts, transaction notebooks, and various encryption tools. So what crimes were they actually committing? And who was the mastermind behind them? Could police reach the boss, or were these merely low-level operatives? Follow the next developments of this case as we uncover a cross-border criminal network you likely never imagined existed right inside Vietnam. Immediately after arresting the 23 suspects, Lam Dong Provincial Police sealed off and searched the entire villa. A large-scale, highly coordinated raid was conducted. The results exceeded expectations. 2 laptops, nearly 30 smartphones, dozens of bank cards, and SIM cards, all carefully sealed as evidence. However, the most valuable evidence came from handwritten notebooks, detailed logs of transactions, assigned roles, and payment methods. The total transaction value mentioned in the documents reached nearly 82 million USD, a staggering figure that shocked investigators. At the provincial police headquarters, lights stayed on for nights in a row. Investigators worked non-stop, decoding digital data pulled from seized devices. Deleted Telegram messages were restored, cryptocurrency wallet addresses and destination bank accounts were traced. Gradually, the entire money laundering operation took shape, revealing that the Dalat group was only one link in a transnational chain funneling funds into crypto exchanges, e-wallets, and foreign bank accounts. Notably, when officers compared timelines, techniques, and operational patterns, they found an uncanny resemblance to a major case cracked by Dong Nai police just 1 month earlier. On the 12th of February 2025, Dong Nai officers working with Hanoi and Da Nang police dismantled a laundering ring serving criminal groups in Cambodia. That ring had created over 30 shell companies and used more than 150 corporate bank accounts to launder over 85 million USD within months. Their methods were nearly identical: purchasing personal data, routing money through multiple layers of accounts, and hiring young operators to handle technical tasks. The two groups had never met, yet their structure was almost identical, especially the repeated mention of a mysterious boss named Billy. Information was promptly shared between provinces. For the first time, cybercrime authorities saw the full picture. This was no longer a set of isolated laundering incidents, but a coordinated international network run from Cambodia with Billy at its center. Back in Lam Dong, investigators began interrogating the 23 suspects. Slowly, the truth emerged. Leading the Dalat group was Levan Diep. At first, he denied everything. But after hours of confrontation, Diep confessed. How he met Billy via telegram, how the laundering deals were arranged, how recruits were selected, work shifts divided, and how funds were forwarded according to orders. Phan Thi B, regarded as the deputy commander on site, initially acted defiant, but once confronted with Diep's confession, she too admitted her role. The remaining members confessed one by one: who opened bank accounts, who handled data entry, who withdrew cash, and even who was assigned to night duty to receive new instructions from Billy. Among the 23 people arrested, only one was innocent. He had simply visited a friend and had no involvement in the Klakbak laundering scheme. After verification, he was released and removed from the case file. The remaining 22 suspects were detained for further investigation. Meanwhile, police continued to trace the flow of money. Each bank account was tracked back to its registered owner. Hundreds of account holders across the country were summoned. Most admitted they had sold or lent their accounts for a small amount of money, roughly the equivalent of $100, unknowingly becoming links in a high-tech criminal chain. The deeper investigators dug, the clearer the scheme became. The masterminds did not need to touch the money directly. They simply collected a pool of clean accounts and used them as fronts, making the tracing process exponentially more difficult. From there, the case evolved into a nationwide warning about the dangerous habit of being careless with personal information and the naive belief of those who think, "I only sold my bank account. I didn't do anything wrong." From the evidence and witness statements, police now had a complete picture of the organization's internal structure. The criminal story began in October 2024, when Levan Diep decided to travel to Cambodia in search of better opportunities. In Ba Vet City, Svay Rieng Province, Cambodia, a location known for casinos serving Vietnamese gamblers, Diep applied for a customer service position for an online gambling app owned by the Bayvit Gaming Company. It was there that his criminal fate began. A Chinese national calling himself Billy, a shareholder of the company, noticed Diep. Realizing Diep had tech skills and spoke Vietnamese, Billy approached him with a proposal. He had massive amounts of dirty money obtained from illegal gambling operations that needed to be laundered, and he wanted Diep to help. In exchange, Billy promised a generous commission, 0.1% of the total laundered funds. A quick calculation was enough laundering. 41 million USD would earn Diep about $41,000. Tempted by the prospect of easy wealth, Diep agreed almost immediately. This was his first misstep, pulling an otherwise ordinary young man into the vortex of financial crime. Returning to Vietnam in mid-November 2024, Diep began to execute the plan. He discreetly contacted Phan Thi B, age 29, an acquaintance with a wide network and an eagerness for money. Once B heard about the operation, she accepted instantly. The two agreed on a revenue-sharing arrangement. Diep would receive 30% of the 0.1% commission, while B would take 70%. B received more because she handled almost everything in Vietnam, from renting locations to recruiting workers and directly operating the network, while Diep served mainly as the link to Boss Billy in Cambodia. From the start, they understood the gravity of their crimes, so every move was calculated to avoid detection. In December 2024, B left her hometown of Ha Tin and traveled to Dalat, a place she considered low risk and easy to blend into. There, she rented a 2-story house on 2 Phuoc Street, Ward 11, in a discreet location. The house was quickly transformed into an underground office. B installed security cameras, purchased desks, computers, phones, and ensured they had a strong, stable internet connection. To handle the huge volume of transactions, Diep and B needed manpower. They quietly recruited 21 young people from various provinces via personal networks or hidden social media channels, mostly tech-savvy youth seeking work, drawn in by promises of easy tasks, high pay. These recruits were housed directly in the rented property, living and working under disciplined supervision by Diep and B. To avoid suspicion, they occasionally rented additional small apartments in Ward 7 and Ward 12 to rotate living arrangements. However, most of the time, Everyone stayed at the Ward 11 headquarters for easier operation. Not a single one of them registered temporary residence, an administrative violation, but also a tactic to avoid leaving any trace in government databases. Once staffing was sufficient, Diep and B divided responsibilities. The main task of each member was to open bank accounts. Each person was given money to open multiple accounts at different banks under their own names and in some cases using information from relatives or friends. After opening the accounts, they had to surrender all ATM cards, login credentials, and passwords to B. She collected everything and sent it to Diep, who then forwarded it to Billy in Cambodia. Within a short time, the group had registered over 100 bank accounts, ready to be used for laundering. This became the core component of the scheme, turning hundreds of clean accounts into perfect fronts for dirty money flowing across borders. By late 2024, the laundering system was fully operational. Each day, at specific hours, Billy's network in Cambodia transferred funds into dozens of accounts controlled by Diep's team. These funds originated from illegal gambling and scam operations managed by Billy. As soon as the money arrived in the accounts, instructions were sent through the Telegram app. Billy created a private chat group where he posted a QR code representing the final destination account, and along with the exact amount to be transferred. Upon receiving the command, each member of Diep's team immediately scanned the QR code using their banking apps and transferred all incoming funds to the designated account. Speed was everything. Each step had to be completed within minutes before banks or authorities noticed any irregularities. That's why all 23 members took shifts, operating around the clock to ensure no transaction was ever missed. They worked silently, day and night, only resting when the daily batch of transfers was complete. The illegal funds flowed through Diep's team and were quickly legitimized in the final destination accounts under Billy's command. In reality, this was only one layer in multiple layers of transactions Billy used to erase the origins of the money. Even within the Dalat transfer hub alone, the daily volume was enormous. $820,000 to $1 million, $230,000 moved through Diep's accounts every day. Accumulated over a short period, the total surged to nearly 82 million USD laundered before police raided the operation. In return, Diep's group earned 0.1% of the total amount laundered. After splitting the commission 30-70, Levan Diep pocketed roughly $240,360 a day, while Phan TB earned about $578,140 a day. Lower-level members received fixed salaries or smaller cuts. Notably, the payment records later seized by police documented the profit-sharing structure in detail, organized and transparent like a legitimate business. With such easy money at their fingertips, the entire group became blinded by profit, forgetting that law enforcement could intervene at any moment. Diep likely believed he was just a transporter, not directly scamming anyone, and therefore assumed he was difficult to trace. That complacency pulled them deeper into criminality. To maintain total secrecy, Diep's team implemented strict rules. They rarely left the house, and when necessary, they went out in small groups to buy food or supplies to avoid drawing attention. Noise was kept to a minimum, and curtains remained closed at all times. All communication with Boss Billy was done exclusively via encrypted telegram messages to avoid surveillance. They also agreed on a contingency plan. If discovered, they would destroy evidence immediately and scatter. But at dawn on the 12th of March 2025, police raided the villa far faster than anyone expected. Their escape plan collapsed instantly, and the entire group was arrested. The question now was, how could authorities bring the mastermind to justice? Through Vietnam's Ministry of Public Security, Billy's criminal file was forwarded to Interpol, along with a request for cooperation with Cambodian authorities. Although Billy was only an alias, data from the Bavet Gaming Company and Diep's testimony allowed investigators to narrow down several Chinese suspects active near the border. An international warrant may have been prepared for Billy under money laundering charges. The hunt for the mastermind remains challenging, but exposing his role was already a significant breakthrough. Unlike typical cases, this investigation involved two layers of perpetrators: the hidden mastermind and the operators who carried out the laundering process. First is Billy, the mysterious name repeated in every suspect's testimony. He was described as a middle-aged Chinese man and a shareholder of the gaming company in Bavet, Cambodia. It is likely that Billy had spent years in the underground gambling and financial world, amassing deep knowledge of cross-border money laundering. His choice of the English nickname Billy was deliberate, easy for Vietnamese operators to remember, and fostering a false sense of friendliness to recruit people like Diep. Billy was the brain behind the entire network, designing the multi-layered account structure, inventing the QR code command system, and orchestrating massive illicit cash flows every day. His motive was pure greed. He pocketed the majority of profits by laundering money for criminal organizations, helping them conceal their operations and reinvest into new illegal ventures. Psychologically, Billy was extremely calculating. He never revealed himself to Diep's group in person. All communication was conducted online, and his real identity remained hidden. This showed that Billy had significant experience evading law enforcement and fully understood the risks he faced if caught. Next were the direct operators in Vietnam, led by Le Van Diep and Phan Thi Bay. Le Van Diep, born in 1998, was only 27 at the time of his arrest, originating from Cam Vinh Commune, Cam Suyen District, Ha Tin Province. Before committing the crime, Diep had a relatively clean background. A college graduate in electrical engineering, formerly employed in the Khai An Economic Zone, Ha Tin, married with a young child. His family were farmers, his parents were known as kind people, and he himself had no prior violations or negative reputation in his hometown. Neighbors described Diep as gentle, cheerful, friendly, even a bit shy. That is why the news of his arrest as the leader of a money laundering ring shocked his entire community. Many believed he had been manipulated or acted recklessly without understanding the consequences. However, developments in the case showed that Diep was far from passive. In fact, he played a crucial role as the link between Billy and the domestic laundering network. Exposure to the gambling environment in Cambodia may have tempted him with the lure of easy money. From an ordinary husband and father, he spiraled into becoming a money laundering specialist within just a few months. Psychologically, Diep appeared intelligent, with basic knowledge of technology and finance, but lacked the mental resilience to resist criminal temptation. He may have convinced himself that laundering money didn't directly harm anyone, leading him deeper into wrongdoing. That combination of naivety and greed turned Diep into a criminal at a young age. Phan Thi Bay was his most capable accomplice and effectively acted as the co-leader. The fact that she received 70% of the profit shows she was ambitious and bold. Her difficult upbringing may have pushed her to take extreme risks for financial gain. In any case, B represents a rare example of a woman becoming involved in high-tech financial crime, demonstrating that greed can transcend gender when the opportunity appears. Beyond the Diep duo, there were 21 additional accomplices, mostly young men in their 20s from diverse backgrounds. Many had some technical knowledge. Some had previously worked in IT or accounting but joined the operation due to low income and the allure of fast cash. Others were unemployed and eager for quick earnings. They were not masterminds, but their actions were still dangerous. Some voluntarily recruited each other, while others were persuaded by promises of high pay. Although their personal motives varied, they all became links in the money laundering machine, meaning they became part of an organized criminal system. Had the operation not been dismantled in time, some of them might have risen to become another Diep or B in the future. After an intensive investigation phase, police completed the case file and officially charged 22 defendants with money laundering under Vietnam's penal code. Among them, Le Van Diep and Phan Thi Bay were identified as the ringleaders and will bear primary legal responsibility. All defendants were transferred to the detention center awaiting trial. The case attracted large public attention due to its unprecedented scale, so the legal proceedings are expected to be strict and closely monitored. The first instance trial expected at the Lam Dong Provincial People's Court is anticipated to be highly intense. Standing before the court, the 22 individuals who once collaborated seamlessly may now shift to blaming one another, denying responsibility, or some may plead guilty in hopes of receiving leniency. Legally, the charge of money laundering in Vietnam carries severe penalties. Under current law, if the laundered amount exceeds $20,000, the maximum sentence can reach 15 years in prison. With nearly 82 million USD involved in this case, it is highly likely that Le Van Diep and Phan Thi Bay will face the highest sentencing bracket. Other defendants may receive lighter sentences depending on their involvement, but almost none will avoid prison terms lasting several years. In addition to jail time, the court may impose supplementary penalties, such as monetary fines equivalent to $2,000 to $10,000, and confiscation of all related assets. Although most of the 82 million USD may have been transferred abroad, authorities will still attempt to recover as much as possible. For example, the 0.1% commission earned by Deep's group, estimated at around $82,000, will be fully seized if it has not already been spent. In the end, it reflects a simple truth: money earned illegally never stays for long. More importantly, over 20 young men and women at the prime of their youth will now have to abandon their dreams behind bars, all because of their desire to get rich quickly. This is a harsh lesson for anyone naive enough to believe that getting rich is easy. Without victims of online gambling scams and without young operators forwarding money every night in Dalat, Billy's network would have had no fuel to run on. Therefore, everyone must remain vigilant against suspicious calls or messages, avoid sharing bank account information with strangers, and absolutely refrain from engaging in online gambling. And what about you? What lesson do you take away from this heartbreaking case? Share your thoughts with the team in the comments below. We look forward to hearing your opinions and discussing today's video with you. And before you go, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to support Vietnamese Case Files, where many more thrilling and eye-opening stories await. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.